Every generation of baseball fans eventually asks the same impossible question. Who is the greatest player to ever step onto a major league field? For decades, that conversation has included names like Babe Ruth, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Ted Williams, Barry Bonds, and now, more than ever, Shohei Ohtani. But over the past few days, that debate has become louder than ever. It all began when former Major League pitcher Bobby Witt, the father of Royals superstar Bobby Witt Jr., shared his thoughts during a baseball discussion. Before anyone twists his words, it's important to understand that he didn't dismiss Shohei Ohtani. In fact, he did the opposite. He praised him. He acknowledged that Ohtani is one of the most extraordinary players baseball has ever seen. He pointed to Ohtani's historic combination of power and speed, including the first 50 home run, 50 stolen base season in Major League history. He praised Ohtani's ability to dominate as both a hitter and a pitcher, something modern baseball had never truly witnessed. But then he drew a line. As incredible as Ohtani has become, Witt believed Barry Bonds still deserves to stand above everyone else. His reasoning wasn't based on emotion. It wasn't based on popularity. It came down to how he personally defines complete baseball greatness. Barry Bonds wasn't simply one of the greatest hitters who ever lived. He was also an elite defensive outfielder for much of his career. He won 8 Gold Gloves. He covered ground. He saved runs. He impacted games even when the ball wasn't in his hands at the plate. To Witt, those defensive contributions matter. And because Ohtani spends many of his games as a designated hitter, he felt Bonds still holds the edge when evaluating complete players. It's a viewpoint that plenty of baseball fans understand. After all, Barry Bonds owns Major League Baseball's all-time home run record with 762. 7 MVP awards. 14 All-Star selections. One of the most feared hitters pitchers have ever faced. Whether people admire him, criticize him, or debate different chapters of his career, almost nobody questions his talent. Barry Bonds changed the sport. But that's exactly where this debate becomes fascinating. Because Shohei Ohtani isn't trying to become the next Barry Bonds. He's doing something baseball hasn't truly seen in over a century. When fans compare Bonds and Ohtani, they're often comparing two completely different types of greatness. Barry Bonds mastered one side of the game better than almost anyone who has ever lived. Shohei Ohtani is attempting to master two. Think about that for a moment. Imagine asking Aaron Judge to become an all-star starting pitcher. Imagine asking Paul Skeens to hit 40 home runs. Imagine asking Ronald Acuna Jr. to pitch 7 scoreless innings every 5th day while continuing to lead off the lineup. It sounds ridiculous. Yet that's essentially what Ohtani has spent years doing. Every 5 or 6 days, he prepares like an ace pitcher. The rest of the week, he prepares like one of baseball's most dangerous sluggers. Most players dedicate every ounce of energy to becoming elite at one job. Ohtani has built his career around succeeding at 2 of the hardest jobs in professional sports simultaneously. That's why so many current players describe him as something baseball has never experienced before. Not because he's simply talented. Because what he attempts every season isn't supposed to be possible. And that's where comparing him to Barry Bonds becomes incredibly complicated. How do you compare a player who hit more home runs than anyone in history with someone who throws 100-mile-per-hour fastballs and launches 450-foot home runs in the same week? How do you compare offensive dominance against two-way dominance? Which accomplishment carries more value? There isn't an easy answer. Statistics help. Awards help. Championships help. But eventually, every comparison reaches the same wall. They're measuring different things. Bonds overwhelmed pitchers with unmatched plate discipline, incredible power, and an eye that many consider the greatest in baseball history. Pitchers feared walking him because they hated putting him on base. They feared pitching to him because they knew the ball might disappear into the seats. Entire game plans revolved around avoiding Barry Bonds. Ohtani creates a completely different problem. When he's hitting, opposing pitchers must survive one of baseball's most explosive bats. When he's pitching, opposing hitters have to solve one of baseball's nastiest arsenals. Some days he can beat you with a towering home run. Other days he can strike out 10 batters without allowing a run. Sometimes he does both. That combination forces baseball fans to rethink how greatness should even be measured. Should greatness be judged by offensive production alone? Should defense carry equal weight? Should pitching count separately? Or should doing two elite jobs at once completely redefine the conversation? That's why this debate refuses to disappear. And it's why fans from different generations often reach different conclusions. Older fans remember watching Barry Bonds terrorize pitchers every single night. Younger fans are watching Shohei Ohtani rewrite expectations in real time. Neither side is necessarily wrong. They're simply valuing different kinds of greatness. History has always done this. When Babe Ruth retired, people wondered whether anyone would ever match his impact. Then came Willie Mays. Then Hank Aaron. Then Barry Bonds. Now Shohei Ohtani has entered that same conversation. Not by copying what those legends accomplished, but by creating an entirely new blueprint. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part of all. Baseball has existed for well over 100 years. Thousands of incredible players have reached the major leagues. Hundreds have become all-stars. Dozens have become Hall of Famers. Yet almost nobody has forced baseball to invent new comparisons. Shohei Ohtani has. Because when people ask whether he's a better hitter or a better pitcher, they've already lost the point. He's both. And that simple fact is what makes this discussion so difficult. It's also what makes it one of the most fascinating debates baseball has had in generations. The question isn't simply whether Barry Bonds was greater than Shohei Ohtani. The real question is whether baseball has ever seen another player quite like Shohei Ohtani. And depending on who you ask, the answer may change. But one thing is becoming harder and harder to argue against. Whether he ultimately finishes with 300 home runs, 500 home runs, multiple Cy Young awards, or even more MVP trophies, Shohei Ohtani has already forced baseball to redefine what a superstar can be. And that's only the beginning of this story. That's where this conversation takes an even more interesting turn. The farther you dig into the Ohtani versus Bonds debate, the more you realize that statistics alone can't settle it. On paper, baseball has always been a numbers game. Home runs, batting average, OPS, WAR, strikeouts, ERA, Gold Gloves, MVP awards. Those numbers tell an incredible story. But sometimes they don't tell the entire story. Because every generation of baseball is different. The pitchers are different. The training methods are different. The travel is different. The equipment changes. Even the baseball itself has changed from era to era. That's why comparing legends across generations has always been one of the hardest conversations in sports. Would Babe Ruth dominate today's game? Would Barry Bonds put up the same numbers against modern bullpens that regularly feature relievers throwing 100 miles per hour? Would Ohtani have done the same thing in the early 2000s? No one knows. And that's exactly why the debate never ends. What we do know is what Shohei Ohtani is accomplishing today. Every season seems to produce another milestone that nobody expected to see. People once believed a player could either become an elite hitter or an elite pitcher. Ohtani ignored that choice. Instead of picking one path, he chose both. Think about the workload involved. Starting pitchers spend days preparing for one appearance every 5 or 6 games. They study hitters. They recover after throwing more than 100 pitches. Their entire weekly schedule revolves around protecting their arm. Meanwhile, everyday hitters are preparing for something completely different. They take batting practice, study opposing pitchers, adjust their swings, prepare for 4 or 5 trips to the plate every night. Those are already 2 full-time jobs. Yet somehow, Ohtani has spent years balancing both. It's difficult enough to become an all-star at one position. Doing it twice at the same time almost sounds impossible. That's why so many players have openly admitted they struggle to describe what they're watching. Even veteran stars who have spent decades around baseball often run out of comparisons. The obvious comparison is Babe Ruth. But even that isn't perfect. Ruth eventually stopped pitching regularly once he became the game's biggest offensive force. Ohtani has continued doing both. He hasn't abandoned one side of his game to strengthen the other. He's committed to maintaining both. And that's what separates him from virtually everyone who has ever played. Another criticism often appears whenever these debates begin. Some fans argue that because Ohtani serves as a designated hitter when he isn't pitching, he doesn't contribute defensively the way players like Barry Bonds once did. On the surface, that argument sounds reasonable. After all, Bonds spent years patrolling the outfield. He won multiple Gold Gloves. He made difficult catches look routine. Defense mattered. It still does. But this is where the conversation becomes much more nuanced. Pitching is defense. In fact, it's arguably the most important defensive position in baseball. A pitcher influences every single batter that steps into the box. Every strikeout prevents the ball from ever being put into play. Every weak ground ball begins with the pitcher executing his pitch exactly where he wanted. When Ohtani steps onto the mound, he isn't avoiding defense. He is defense. He becomes the centerpiece of the entire game. If he throws 7 scoreless innings while striking out double-digit hitters, that defensive value stretches far beyond anything a designated hitter normally contributes. That's why many analysts believe describing Ohtani as just a DH completely misses the point. The designated hitter is only half of his job description. The other half begins every 5th or 6th day when he picks up the baseball. And on those nights, he transforms into one of the most dominant pitchers in the sport. Very few athletes in professional sports ask their bodies to perform at such a high level in completely different disciplines. One requires explosive rotational power and split-second reaction time. The other demands precision, stamina, arm strength, and mechanical consistency over more than 100 pitches. Maintaining excellence in either role would already be remarkable. Maintaining both borders on unbelievable. That's one reason Ohtani has earned such respect throughout Major League Baseball. Players understand the physical demands better than anyone. Fans see the highlights. Players understand the preparation. They understand the hours in the training room, the recovery process, the video sessions, the endless adjustments needed to stay healthy through a 6-month season. They know how difficult it is simply to survive a major league schedule. Watching someone dominate on both sides of the game changes the way they view greatness. And perhaps that's why this debate has become so passionate. Barry Bonds reached heights as a hitter that few players will ever approach. His plate discipline remains legendary. His power was historic. Pitchers often feared him so much that intentional walks became a regular strategy. Entire defensive alignments changed because Barry Bonds was standing in the batter's box. That's greatness. No serious baseball fan denies it. But Ohtani presents opponents with an entirely different challenge. One night, you're trying to figure out how to retire him as a hitter. A few days later, you're trying to figure out how to hit against him. That's not simply versatility. That's something baseball has almost never witnessed. Maybe that's why this debate doesn't have a perfect answer. Maybe it isn't supposed to. Perhaps Barry Bonds represents the highest standard of offensive dominance. Perhaps Shohei Ohtani represents something entirely different, a player who has expanded the limits of what people believed a single baseball player could accomplish. And if that's true, then comparing them isn't really about deciding who's better. It's about appreciating two completely different forms of greatness that changed baseball forever. By now, this discussion had grown into something much bigger than one podcast or one opinion. It wasn't just about Barry Bonds anymore. It wasn't even just about Shohei Ohtani. It had become a debate about how greatness should actually be measured. Should statistics decide everything? Should defense matter more than offense? Can players from completely different eras even be compared fairly? There may never be one perfect answer. But according to the story surrounding Aaron Judge's response, one thing matters more than many fans realize. Experience. Not numbers. Not highlight reels. Experience. There is a huge difference between watching Shohei Ohtani and competing against him. Fans watch him from the stands. Analysts study him from television studios. Former players compare his numbers to legends from decades ago. Current players live it. They prepare for him. They face him. They understand what it's like knowing he can beat you as a hitter one night and as a pitcher the next. That perspective cannot be captured by statistics. It's something only today's players truly understand. That idea was echoed by Alex Rodriguez. Rodriguez has a unique perspective because he experienced both generations of baseball. He played against Barry Bonds during his career. Today he watches Ohtani every week as an analyst. According to Rodriguez, Barry Bonds may be the greatest pure hitter baseball has ever seen. The numbers support that argument. 7 MVP awards. 762 career home runs. Pitchers feared him unlike almost anyone else in history. Sometimes they intentionally walked him simply to avoid throwing him strikes. Rodriguez has always respected Bonds' incredible offensive dominance. But he also believes Ohtani represents something entirely different. Bonds dedicated his career to becoming the greatest hitter possible. Ohtani has chosen one of the hardest paths imaginable. He wants to become one of baseball's best hitters while also remaining one of its best pitchers. Those are already two full-time jobs. Yet somehow he performs both at an elite level. Rodriguez believes that's why Ohtani deserves his own category. Not above Bonds. Not below him. Separate. Because history has never really seen another player doing what Ohtani is doing. Rodriguez also addressed one criticism that frequently appears in these debates. Some people argue Ohtani spends too much time as a designated hitter. Unlike Bonds, they say, he isn't playing defense every day. Rodriguez challenged that idea. When Ohtani is pitching, what is he doing? He's preventing runs. He's striking hitters out. He's controlling the game. That is defense. Pitching is arguably the most valuable defensive position in baseball. So calling Ohtani just a DH ignores half of his value. His defensive contribution simply looks different from an outfielder's. That's something current players understand better than anyone. They know the preparation required to pitch every fifth or sixth day. Then, on the days he isn't pitching, Ohtani still prepares like an everyday superstar hitter. Very few athletes in any sport have ever balanced responsibilities like that. David Ortiz later offered another perspective. Ortiz said Aaron Judge rarely becomes emotional in public. That's why his reported comments stood out. Judge wasn't trying to disrespect Barry Bonds. He wasn't trying to create controversy. He simply wanted to defend a player he deeply respects. Ortiz also reminded fans that Barry Bonds' story is complete. Every achievement has already been written into baseball history. Shohei Ohtani's story is still unfolding. Every season brings another chapter. Another milestone. Another record. Another achievement no one imagined before. That's why Ortiz believes baseball fans should appreciate what they're watching instead of rushing to rank it. Years from now, today's debates will become history. Future generations will study Ohtani's statistics. But today's players experience something different. They compete against him. They prepare for him. They understand just how difficult it is to stop him. Perhaps that's what Aaron Judge's message was really about. Not proving that Ohtani is greater than Barry Bonds, but reminding everyone that some players are so extraordinary they redefine what greatness looks like. Whether someone believes Bonds remains baseball's greatest player or believes Ohtani is creating something entirely new, one fact is becoming harder to ignore with every passing season. Shohei Ohtani is doing something the sport has never truly seen before. And that's exactly why the players sharing the field with him believe the baseball world should appreciate this era while it still can.